Good evening, friends. This is David Warren, and I welcome you to another segment of The Unknown Presidents. Today's president will be our 22nd and our 24th president. Grover Cleveland, who served from 1885 to 1889, and again from 1893 to 1897. That's right. Grover Cleveland is counted twice, and that's because he was elected, then he was defeated, and then he was elected again. So he's counted as two different presidents. To tell you about Grover Cleveland, I give you Pothead Pete. Pete, tell us the story of Grover Cleveland.
Thank you, Dave. Well now, Grover Cleveland, he was an interesting guy. First of all, he was born under the name of Stephen Grover Cleveland. But when he got to be an adult, he dropped the name Stephen and just went by Grover. I guess because when he was a little boy in school, he probably got lots of laughs when the teacher called for Stephen Cleveland. Anyway, he just became Grover. Here's a rare photo of Grover Cleveland in 1864, when he was still a rather thin man. Smart sound. By the time he became president, he had ballooned up to about 250 pounds. His family called him Uncle Jumbo. Grover Cleveland had quite an illustrious career before he became president. He started off as a lawyer, and then he was talked into going into politics, and he was originally he was the assistant district attorney in Erie County, and then he became the sheriff of Erie County. And later he got himself elected mayor of Buffalo, New York. And then later he became governor of New York, so he just moved right on up the line. Now, one interesting thing about Grover Cleveland, when he was the sheriff of Erie County, he actually carried out a couple of hangings. And that was back in the days when they used to hang people. There were a couple of guys who were convicted of murder, and rather than delegate that to one of his deputies, Sheriff Cleveland just decided to do it himself. So he's the one who pulled the lever and sprung the trap and sent those rascals dancing in the air. So because of that, later on, he was known as the Hangman President. When Grover Cleveland decided to run for office, he decided to run for the presidency in the year 1884. One of the things that was brought up about him was that they say that he had an affair with a young woman named Maria Halpin. He took Maria Halpin out on a date, and she was kind of got around, if you know what I mean. Well, she got pregnant, and she had a child, and Grover Cleveland, now, he never really came out and said that child was his, but he accepted responsibility for it when the word came out that he had fathered an illegitimate son, and she named him Oscar Folsom Cleveland. And some people think that maybe that boy didn't belong to Grover, but belonged to a good friend of his who was married, and Grover took the blame since he was a single man. But no one really knows for sure. But that came out, and when it came out that he had fathered an illegitimate son, they said, "Well, what are you going to do, Grover? What are you going to do?" And he said, "Tell them the truth. Just tell them the truth." Well, he owned up to it, and because he was so honest about it, the people like that. His opponent, James Blaine, who had been Secretary of State under James A. Garfield, he tried everything to try to discredit Grover Cleveland. Now, this is a cartoon that was put out during the election of 1884 about Cleveland's illegitimate child. And it went along with the little saying that the Republicans love to repeat. Mama, where's my papa? He's gone to the White House, ha ha. And the more he tried, the worse it made it. Oh, the 1884 campaign between Grover Cleveland and James Blaine was a dirty one. The Republicans referred to the Democratic Party as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. But Grover Cleveland prevailed and was elected the 22nd President of the United States. Now, Grover Cleveland went into the White House as a bachelor. He wasn't married at the time he was elected. But that was all going to change soon. Grover Cleveland married his young 21-year-old ward, a beautiful lady by the name of Frances Folsom. Now, Frances Folsom was the daughter of one of his best friends, but when his best friend died, then he kind of took over the estate, and he took over Frances's welfare. And so he watched her grow from a little baby up into a young girl, and took kind of a shine to her, and by the time she was 21, he was 49 years old, and he fell in love with her and asked her to marry him, and she said yes. He's the only president who actually got married in the White House. Well, he was a right good president. His first term, now he was a real stickler with the press. He didn't much care for the press. He just didn't like them at all. And he was a very stubborn man, very stubborn, and he had kind of a stormy relationship, not just with the press, but with Congress eventually. And finally, when he ran for re-election in 1888, well, he lost to Benjamin Harrison. Grover Cleveland was voted out of office. Well, he thought he was going to go and retire, but there were some other people that had other things in mind. They said, Grover, we need you back in office. And so 4 years later, he ran and was nominated again in the year 1892. And in the election of 1892, this time he won and unseated President Harrison. And so Grover Cleveland was sworn in again in 1893 and began his second presidency. Well, one of the main interesting things that happened in his second presidency was kind of a secret. Cleveland was a big cigar smoker, big beer drinker, big cigar smoker. Turned out that he had cancer in his jaw. Well, nobody knew this, and he didn't want anybody to find out. He couldn't stand the press. The press was always getting their nose in, wanting to know what was going on. He especially didn't like it when they nosed around his little girl, Ruth. And allegedly, his daughter Ruth is who the candy bar Baby Ruth is named for Ruth Cleveland. How about that? Well, they had to operate on Cleveland, but he didn't want the country to know, he didn't want the press to know. So they secreted him out on a boat and took him out on the water. And out there he had emergency surgery on his jaw. They actually cut part of his jaw off and had to replace it with a temporary rubber jaw. And then eventually they put a permanent cast in of his jaw. And but they got the cancer out, and nobody knew about it. And in fact, it wasn't even brought out and discovered until 9 years after Cleveland had died. No one knew about this until 1917, and that was a number of years later. But they kept that under wraps. His second term was not quite as successful as his first term, and a big depression occurred under Cleveland's second term. Cleveland thought he might try to run again in 1896, but he just was tired of being president, I guess, and so he left office in 1897. He's the only president we've got that has served 2 non-consecutive terms, and so because of that, he's considered our 22nd and our 24th president. Well, after leaving office, former President Cleveland, he played the stock market some. He practiced law so he could support his family. And they say by the time he left office, he was worth about $350,000. Well, he retired to Princeton, New Jersey with his family. In 1904, Ruth Cleveland, 12 years old, President Cleveland's oldest daughter, died of diphtheria. And that just absolutely devastated the former president. They say he just never recovered from that. In 1908, in March of 1908, he came down with a bad stomach ailment, some kidney problems, and eventually the former president just died of heart failure. Grover Cleveland died on June the 24th of 1908 at the age of 71. His last words, I do believe, summed up his whole life. He said, "I have tried so hard to do right." No one could argue with that. That's the story of Grover Cleveland.
Good job, Pete, and thank you. Well, there you have it, friends. The story of Grover Cleveland, our only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. That's all for today, my friends. We'll be back later with another unknown president. Until then, this is David Warren. Back to you, Wolf.
Smart Sound. Smart Sound.